I'm about to shoot a video on how to flatten the top of this workbench back here. But before I do that, I thought I'd show you how I like to set up and sharpen this joiner to do the job. Before I get into the specifics of how I like to sharpen the blade, I want to make sure that I've got my mouth adjusted properly. You don't want the mouth too far open, because if you do, when you start planing across the grain, you're more likely to get quite a bit of tear out. So I've got my mouth set at about 10 thousandths. And the way that I checked that was to back the blade off a little bit at a time, test with my little tester block here until the blade just stops cutting. And then I could see how far open the mouth was. Now, this wasn't some hard and fast rule that I read somewhere. It's just a matter of playing around until I got the plane to perform the way I wanted. But you want to do this check before you sharpen. And I'm not going to get into how I adjusted the mouth, because that's different on every plane. The next thing we want to do is shape the blade so we can get the most out of our cutting. And the last time I sharpened this plane, I reground the bevels on the blade, so I've got a very small secondary bevel here. And so that means it shouldn't take a whole lot of time on the stones to get this thing sharp. Okay, we've got all of our sharpening gear out here. We've got everything that I'm not going to be sharpening on a different bench so it doesn't get accidentally sprayed with water while I'm using these water stones. Put the edge of the blade flat on the stone here and just give it a few swipes. Now that I use the ruler trick, that's not as important, but you never know. There might be some garbage on the back of that blade that you want to get rid of before you start sharpening. I have a particular shape that I want to shape it to before I start to polish the edge. And this is one of the few bench planes that, well, I think it's the only bench plane that I use that is basically flat. So you'll see me work really hard on the very corners of this blade to put a slant on them, and that's to prevent the corners from digging in if I have to take a larger bite. But after about 1/4 of an inch in from each edge, it's just going to be straight across. So I'll show you how I do that here. And the pitch on the frog for this plane back here is a standard 45. So I can hone this blade to any angle as long as it's a few degrees less than 45. Otherwise, the bottom of this grind here starts to get in the way when you're trying to cut. So I'm going to do this at 35 degrees. And I'm just setting this edge on this edge and the tip of the blade on the little step. And we're nice and tight. I just flatten these stones so they're ready to cut. So I've got just enough stone here to make this happen. I'm going to reach all the way across with my middle finger, and I'm going to press down on the back of that blade right above where it touches on the stone. And I'm really going to push hard, and I'm going to pull back. And you can see all of the swarf on the stone is right there in that one concentrated spot. So I'll probably do 10 strokes. So that was 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Same thing, reach across with the opposite finger. Get your head right over the stones while you're sharpening. It gives you a lot better balance and control. All right, I've got a burr on either side and no burr in the middle. Because this blade has been freshly ground, it doesn't take very many strokes. So I'm going to try 4 strokes here with my fingers evenly spaced in the center and see if I can get a burr to raise without getting down to that little bevel that I put on either side. And we've got a burr. Okay. So that blade has been shaped. We've gotten down to fresh metal. Because we raised a burr, we know that we're there. We can move up to our first polishing stone. This is a 4000 grit. So in here I'm going to start in the middle, and I'll do about 15 strokes because I really want to start getting the scratches from this other stone out. Now I want to put that pressure on the corners and polish those. I don't have to polish these quite as much because the idea is they're not actually going to be doing any cutting. They're going to be coming up out of the edges so I can get that feathery edge on my shaving. Just do 10 on those. Okay, so now I want to look at my work. It looks like we got a good pattern there. On to our 8000 grit. So you can see how wide the swarf pattern is on this blade. When we're taking shavings, this is about the width of the shaving we're going to be shooting for. And again, I'm only wiping the bevel side and the wheel. I'm not wiping back here. I don't want to break that burr off before it's ready. I want to sharpen it off if I can. Okay, and based on the reflection pattern on that bevel, it looks like I may have taken a little more material on this edge than I did on this edge. But I'll still be able to adjust the plane to make that work. It's not that big a deal. Okay, now we're ready for our ruler trick here. I'm going to set the blade so that the sharp edge is off the edge of the stone. Bring it back on when we go back and forth and just take a few swipes. Doesn't take much. So you're doing two things there. You're getting the burr off, polishing the burr off, and polishing a very micro bevel on this back edge so that you don't have to polish the entire back face of this blade. And I want to make sure I get all the water off. I've got my oily rag here. I'm just going to set this down on the bench in case I got a little water. I'd rather have it in that rag. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and clean out the mouth here. Alright, we'll put our chip breaker back on, turn them at 90 degrees, drop the screw in, slide it back, and rotate it. It looks like it's actually tightened it a little bit. You're protecting that fresh edge at all costs. I usually just set the difference between the chip breaker and the blade by eye. I think if I were to measure it, it would probably be between 25 and 30 thousandths, so just under a 32nd of an inch for this, well, for most jobs. This is just about the only job I use my joiner plane for, is flattening the bench tops. Because you're cutting mostly across the grain in this job, the chip breaker doesn't come quite as much into play. We've got our plane sitting here on the bench. I'm going to grab the back of the blade. First of all, make sure that the blade maker's mark or the plane maker's mark is facing up. And then I'm going to push down with this finger and lift up with this hand so I can have control. And I'm just going to set it straight down through the mouth onto the bench top. Pull it back to the back of the mouth and then rotate it into place. Drop it down onto this little connector. Grab my lever cap and snap it shut. We're going to flip it up. All right, here we are at the sole of the plane. And I think you can see, if I can find it, this side of the blade is sticking out farther. You can see that black line coming across, and it's just sort of gray over here. So I'm going to need to push the lever on the underside of the blade that direction. And hopefully you'll be able to see it move. And if I test it, I'm not getting any cut. So I managed to even it out enough that the whole blade is now below the, oh well, is on the other side of the face of the sole. So I'm going to advance the blade a tiny bit here and check it. Okay, so now we're cutting on this side, not on that side, so I've got to push the lever back the other way towards the high side. Okay, we're cutting there and not cutting over there. So there's a high spot right here that's taking cuts. So we just need to get that over just a little bit more. Try again. Okay, no cut. No cut. No cut. So what we had was where the angle and the flat part met, that was that little arris was the part that was sticking up. So now we should be closer to flat. So no cut. And a cut. Cut. Not quite. So I'm going to pull that lever just a little bit to this side. So that direction. This is a very small adjustment. Cutting, 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 not cutting. Okay, so now we've got the blade taking cuts from about here to about here, which is the flat part on the stone that I showed you while I was honing it. And this plane should be ready to cut. All right, so I think we've got this plane dialed in, but we need to test it on something. I've got a piece of scrap here that's almost as wide as the sole of the plane. Not quite, but that's not too big a deal because we've got the blade shape to only cut about 2/3 of the width of the iron. So let's take a pass down the center here and see what we get. So a little feathery cut. And now it's stopped cutting. And I think that's because I've cut a groove down the middle when I was cleaning this board up. So what we'll do now to get it to cut again is the same thing we will do when we're flattening the bench top, which is work our way across with each stroke. Okay, we've got 3 shavings. This one came out of the center, and it's nice and feathered on both sides. That's those corners that we took off. This is the one off the edge. This was the very last one. And it's nice and crisp on this edge here where the edge of the board is, and feathered on the inside edge where the blade exited the side of the cut. If it's not up here already, I'll have the video on flattening the top of the bench up real soon.